Hello and welcome to my training specific to the interactions between individuals with autism and law enforcement. This training is specific to the state of Utah and in response to the creation and passage of House Bill 433, which mandated Utah peace officers receive at least 1 hour of autism-specific training annually. My name is Michelle McKnight-Lazat. I'm an assistant professor at Utah State University, and I have been engaging professionally with individuals on the autism spectrum for the last 15 years. So again, we're going to review autism specifics. We are going to discuss specific tactics and tools you can use when working with people on the spectrum. And finally, we'll take a quiz to demonstrate learning from this course. So first off with language, some of you may have noticed that I went back and forth between using autistic person and person with autism. For the longest time, professionals have been taught to use identity or person first language, which would be a person with autism. However, now people on the autism spectrum are reclaiming identity first language, which is to use the term autistic, because they say that if you were to take away their autism, they wouldn't be who they are. So I just want everybody to understand that I'm being respectful and I'm informed. So current autism statistics find that 1 in 44 children in the US have been diagnosed with an autism spectrum disorder. This just went, it increased in about October from 1 in 54. It is 4 times more common in males than females. However, there is a bit of discussion around that because females tend to get diagnosed much later in life. So this 1 in 44 isn't reflective of that because that is of 8-year-olds. So this is only stating that at the time people are 8, they're 4 times more likely to be males. It does occur across all racial and ethnic and socioeconomic groups. And there are about 3.5 million autistic persons in the US, and globally that makes up about 1 to 2% of the population. And that's all to say that if you haven't yet had an interaction on the job with a person with autism, you will. It's a when, not an if situation, which is why it's so important that all officers are trained for these interactions. So what is autism? Well, autism is a developmental disability that's marked by impairments in communication and social emotional functioning, as well as behavior problems that include restricted patterns of interest. There's no blood test, genetic tests, neurological tests that can reliably confirm autism. It is diagnosed through observation by professionals. At this point in time, there is no specific biomedical marker, although that is in the works, but there's also no cure for autism. So why should this matter to people like you? And it's important because individuals with autism are 7 times more likely to have an encounter with the criminal justice system, and that is both as victim and offender. Individuals on the spectrum are disproportionately at high risk for experiencing abuse and victimization, and we're going to talk about why and what that looks like. So this is not all to, I want y'all to look at this in the frame of both a victim and offender, not just as the offender side. So secondly, and maybe this is primarily, is if you watch the news, it's really obvious to see that the encounters police are having with people on the autism spectrum often end negatively. So this is a way to both prevent you going on the news as well as, you know, being some CNN case study, which I don't want for anybody. So individuals with ASD and their caregivers are often dissatisfied with the police encounters they are having. And finally, 72% of law enforcement officers nationwide report they've never had a training about autism and that they would like some training. And there was a smaller study done more recently that showed officers who had any type of training specific to autism did feel more comfortable in both their encounters and in the outcomes of their encounters. This is one of the most important takeaways I hope you get from today, is that if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. Often people have one encounter and then kind of generalize that to every single person with autism is exactly the same as that person. And that's obviously not reality. So having an autism specific understanding of behaviors is so vital because in my mind, the interactions between a person on the autism spectrum and law enforcement is a perfect storm of all the things that can go wrong due to innately the disorder and in autism. So this quote I love, and it says, law enforcement officers often encounter and misinterpret the actions of autistic individuals, such as stimming, no eye contact, lack of verbal response, as suspicious, non-compliant, disorderly, threatening, or intoxicated when it's simply autism. So this is so imperative because in my mind, this is why so many encounters go wrong, is all the ways y'all were taught and all the things you were taught to look for that are red flags for you are inherent characteristics of autism. So, not looking at you in the eye seems suspicious or seems like, they're trying to hide something. Maybe not communicating with you in a way you would typically expect. Those things, trigger your red flags, which make you think there's something more going on when those are just their inherent characteristics. And again, it's so difficult because there's not a way to just know right offhand when you show up at a call unless you've been told that somebody has autism. So specific to your work in law enforcement, an individual on the spectrum may have an impaired sense of danger. So they may not recognize that walking in the street or getting too close to traffic or something like that could cause them harm. They may wander into bodies of water, traffic, or other dangers. And much like neurotypical people, they may be overwhelmed by your presence. So you simply showing up may be enough to trigger their anxiety and behaviors. They may fear a person in uniform, and this often, much like everybody else, is dependent on how this individual was taught, as a young person, as a child, to interact with law enforcement, what they've been told. And they also may exhibit curiosity or reach for objects or equipment. So we're going to talk about that, but some individuals on the spectrum will reach for your shiny badge or your handcuffs, or worst case scenario, your gun. They may struggle with that impulse control. They may react with fight or flight. So as soon as you show up, they may run. And again, that signals, a red flag for you when that may just be a reaction to their anxiety. An individual on the spectrum may not respond to your commands. That may be just stop, and they may not stop. And they may not understand or recognize your uniform and why that matters. So we all typically assume that when a police car shows up, everybody knows, okay, I've got to stop and listen. I understand what's happening, but that's not necessarily true for people on the autism spectrum. So let's start with some of the basics of what are autism spectrum disorders. And this license plate is included simply as an illustration of, if you see this on a car, acknowledge that potentially somebody in the car driving the car is on the spectrum, just to kind of give you a little bit of forewarning. So the DSM-5, the most recent edition, states that autism requires persistent deficits across multiple parts of life in both social communication and social interaction. And when you think of your job, day to day, call to call, most of it is those two things, right? It's mostly social communication and social interaction. So every person that has an autism diagnosis has to have persistent deficits across those two areas. So keep that in mind. Like all the other things are parts of autism, but aren't required for a diagnosis. Deficits in interaction and communication are required for that diagnosis for every single individual. Individuals may also have restricted or repetitive patterns of behavior, interest, or activities, such as repetitive motor movements. So stimming, we're going to talk a lot about what stimming is so you can identify it, but it can be clapping, flapping, spinning, making noises, any kind of repetitive physical movement that feels good to that person. They typically have an insistence on sameness and are inflexible. So their routine is typically really important to them. And so you're showing up on a call may be interfering with their day-to-day schedule and routine, and may, already have that person irritated and frustrated. Typically, we said they have narrow or fixated interests, and that could be any topic in the world. Typically, it's cars, trains, movies, shows, anything that, you know, can be somebody could be very passionate about. And then finally, individuals on the spectrum are often over or under reactive to sensory input, and it's typically over, and it's things like bright lights, loud sounds, touch, that really can impact them differently than it might somebody without an autism diagnosis. So the newest DSM changed some of the language we use for autism. Formerly, people were called either high functioning or low functioning, with people who were high functioning being people who had verbal skills and who, you know, maybe had jobs and did other things out in the community. That was terminology for high functioning. And then low functioning was people that maybe were nonverbal or had a cognitive impairment and just needed more assistance in their day-to-day life. But unfortunately, that terminology is ineffective because there's no test or no line or no IQ level that determines whether somebody is high or low functioning. It's really just talk. And there are people that are nonverbal who have a very high IQ. And so hearing terminology like low functioning is detrimental. So we need to change the language around to being the least severe individuals on the spectrum are just labeled as requiring support. In the medium area is requiring substantial support, and those individuals with intellectual disabilities, other comorbid impairments with autism would now be labeled as requiring very substantial support. And this is just important to know. So typically people think the autism spectrum is linear, that somebody falls on one part of the spectrum and that's where they are. But the reality is individuals are unique and different. So they can have, you know, very high language skills, but have very low motor skills and perception. They might have very high sensory needs, which means they're very impacted by sensory events that are going on around them, but have very limited executive functioning. And we're going to talk about what executive functioning is. So just understand that it's not linear. If somebody says a term like high or low functioning, it really doesn't mean that much because you don't know what area this individual is high or low functioning in. So some common ASD characteristics are that individuals typically have delayed speech and language skills. Like we said, that's inherent to the disability itself, is that they have communication deficits. They may not respond to their name or verbal commands. They very typically avoid eye contact. I had one woman on the spectrum tell me, Michelle, I can either look at you or listen to you, but I can't do both. What do you want? And obviously, when we're interacting with somebody, we prefer they are listening to us. So it doesn't matter to me that they're not making eye contact, but you need to hear that it's not something that they're being deceitful or hiding a behavior, which is the lack of eye contact. Individuals often, it's about 80 to 90% have sensory issues. They may have great difficulty understand other people's thoughts and feelings and body language. Like we said, they're very routine oriented and may have a very rigid schedule, may be passionate about topics and interests, and may have executive functioning difficulties. Executive functioning is something we all have various strengths and weaknesses in, every single one of us. So executive functioning is all of these categories that are listed. So specific to people with autism, they may have difficulties with cognitive flexibility, and that's important because, again, if somebody was taught for their entire childhood that if the police come, they're going to kill you, that's going to be the concrete thought they have, is that in this interaction, they're going to die. And that's important for you to know because they don't have the ability to understand that that's not the reality. That's, you know, more than likely never going to happen to them. So they may very much go into just a straight fight or flight reaction, just seeing you. They may have difficulty with time awareness and management. They may have difficulty with self-organization and planning. Important to know is there are pretty strong deficits in social judgment and appropriate social behavior. This is often why the police are called in the first place, because somebody is just acting weird. And people take that to be a lot of things. Somebody may just be strolling and stimming. And that looks weird to the general public. So they call the cops because they think it might be drugs. Or an individual might not understand all the rules of social behavior around dating or around stalking. And so you may get calls for those things, as we're going to talk about as we go on. Individuals may have difficulty with multitasking, but don't we all? And they may struggle with inhibitory control, which is problematic and goes back to things like reaching for your shiny badge or worse, your gun, with self-restraint, again, stopping themselves from doing those behaviors. Memory can be a problem, which can come out in an interaction with you when they don't remember their address or their age or where they live. Individuals can struggle with emotional control and regulation. That might be, I don't want to, talk to you, so I'm going to sit here and just rock and not talk to you because you're messing up my schedule. And then again, this difficulty with stress tolerance. So an individual likely is already having a bad day if they're, had the cops called for them or on them. So therefore their stress tolerance may already be pushing its boundaries right at the start of your interaction. So stimming, I think stimming is one of the most important parts of this course. If there's one thing you can take away behaviorally, I hope that it's you learn about stimming. When I have taught this class live, I would say 90% of officers report not knowing what stimming behaviors are. So this is imperative with people on the spectrum, so that if you see this behavior, your mind doesn't automatically go to drugs or high. It can go to autism as well. So stimming behaviors are self-soothing, repetitive motor movements such as hand flapping, clapping, pacing, and spinning. There's unlimited amounts of stimming behaviors. We're going to watch some videos about what those are so you can see various self-stimming behaviors. Stimming can happen when somebody's happy, mad, frustrated, sad. It's really just how that individual calms themselves and makes themselves feel better. And oftentimes it's mistaken for drug use and mental health disturbances, which is a lot of times why encounters go poorly. And this is another great thing to know. Unless a behavior is self-injurious, please don't try and stop that behavior or ask that individual to stop. If they're not hurting themselves, their stimming may be the only way that they're able to continue their interaction with you. That stimming behavior is soothing them enough that they can have this interaction with you. So don't ask them to stop it unless they are truly actually hurting themselves. And here we're going to watch a video that is on YouTube from a uploader called Autism Family. It's in the references and in the notes if you would like to find it again. But look for what this stimming behavior looks like and if you've ever seen it before.
What are you doing?
Don't do that. I see ABC song.
That's so cool.
And bluebirds.
Next, I'm going to show you a young woman who is also stimming. Her father has a YouTube page discussing her. So I want you to, again, look and see the behaviors she's doing and notice if there are anything you've seen before.
We call fish bubbles. Abby has been doing the stim for years, and it's personally my favorite stim. I think it's soothing for her, and it's a happy stim. Oftentimes, Abigail will combine stims. So this is her fish bubbles and rocking stim. Abigail's yelling stim. Honestly, not my favorite.
So stimming is like any kind of repetitive behavior. It's like you guys see Abby flapping and yelling and doing, her little finger thingies and stuff like that. So, there's like repetitive behaviors. And I think that it is to self-regulate because lots of stimulus is coming in, and
She does this when she's seeking that deep pressure, basically contracting all muscles at once.
Does that make you tired afterwards? Whew. It's like every muscle in your body.
Yeah, she was
Yeah, get another one in.
there.
Even your toes.
So I think that Abigail's
This one we call squints. Abigail does this. Sometimes she'll contract her whole face. Sometimes it's just her eyes. We first thought that she might need glasses, but we did have her vision checked.
One thing that I always want to know is why. What is causing
You look like a goober.
Hopefully those videos gave you some good ideas of what stimming can look like. As I've said over and over again, it's different for every single person, but just to be aware that those behaviors don't necessarily mean somebody's intoxicated or inebriated. So we're going to move on to language and why it's so necessary to address your style of communication when you're interacting with people on the spectrum. It's very common that individuals on the spectrum have delayed speech and language skills, especially so when they're under stress or duress, which they likely are when they interact with you. It is very typical that individuals on the spectrum are slow processing verbal information and typically do better with written information. Well, look at your job, most of it's verbal back and forth. So if you're asking, 3 questions at once, what's your name, birth date, an address, you're going to get a very long pause and then maybe an answer to one of them if the person is verbal. So it takes a lot longer to process information. Individuals with autism can be nonverbal, as in they don't speak, they don't have language. And there's also individuals that are selectively mute, meaning they go nonverbal when they're under duress. So somebody may not just be refusing to talk to you, they may truly not have language. Individuals on the spectrum have unusual speech patterns or can have unusual speech patterns. We're going to see that a little later in a police interaction. And they may use things like echolalia. I'm going to assume most of you don't know what echolalia is. It is when an individual just repeats something they've heard. So an individual, you may ask their name and you may get the weather report, what's your name? And they say, well, it's 76 today with a chance of rain, and tomorrow's looking better at a high of 80. They may repeat Disney movies. They may repeat, video game lines. It could be anything. It's just that they're not responding to you in a way that makes sense to you. And they also may have been taught scripted language. So scripted language will seem scripted, funny enough. And so it might be something like, my name is Michelle McKnight Lazat. I work at Utah State University. You need to call my mom because I have autism. So a lot of individuals on the spectrum have been taught these scripts for different interactions. So you may get this very robotic answer. So just briefly, if you've interacted with people on the spectrum, you know that there's other common comorbid conditions. One thing to know for sure is that only about 50% of people on the spectrum have intellectual disabilities. So that means the other 50% don't. Obviously, there's some different numbers in there, but so just don't assume that because somebody has autism, they also have an intellectual disability. That's only about half of people. They can have other mental health problems. They can have other physical issues, but just some information for you. And something that's super important to know, and this study just came out this past year and it was specific to Utah, autistic individuals die by suicide at rates 3 times higher than the population. And the group that's at greatest risk are females between ages 30 to 39. And most autistic adolescents who were bullied, here, let me rephrase that. Individuals that are autistic and were bullied have a higher chance of dying by suicide. And what's terrifying is 46 to 63% of autistic youth report being bullied. And it's important to differentiate that because individuals on the spectrum may not have the social intelligence or awareness to recognize they're being bullied. So I would estimate the rates are much higher than that, than the 46 to 63, because typically autistic youth can come across as weird or odd. And we know at that time in life, that's exactly what your peers are trying to figure out is something weird or odd. So I would go into situations assuming they have been bullied. Individuals on the spectrum may have conflicting body language or facial expressions. They may be, relaxed physically, but, have a very angry face, or the opposite. As I've said, they may have a loud, high, or monotone voice. They may have a stilted manner of speaking. Beware of using things like humor, idioms, and sarcasm. Individuals on the spectrum understand language literally. So for example, if you say, give me a minute and I'll be right back, and the individual may look at their wristwatch, and when it's been 60 seconds, they may say, you're not back, where are you? Your language needs to be concise and concrete. So it's the idioms are things like if you were to say it's raining cats and dogs, and they look out the window and say, no, it's raining rain, which is water. So when stressed, individuals on the spectrum may lose some of their communication skills. They may seem evasive or give you answers that seem like they're not attached to what you're actually asking. So individuals on the spectrum have been shown to have difficulty with theory of mind, which is the skill of understanding our own emotions and then making sense of our behaviors and our thought processes and beliefs. So, maybe it's that my kid took too long getting his jacket on all by himself today, and that made us late for school. So I've been agitated and irritated and angry. And, I had to think about that myself and say, oh, okay, I'm in this bad mood because of this, this, and this. An individual on the spectrum may not have that self-awareness or ability. And that goes both ways. So that can be both about themselves and their feelings, but also other people's feelings. So they may not understand that, oh, this person in the other car that hit them is hurt. They may just be mad that they're missing, their video game, or they're going to be late to their next thing, and may not show any empathy whatsoever, because they're not always able to understand other people's emotions. And the same for yourself, if you're getting frustrated or angry, or your emotions may not be recognized and otherwise. And it's important, again, to note when we talk about mental health that this inability to note your own feelings is related to increased levels of depression and anxiety. So that emotional regulation piece is really hard for individuals on the spectrum. So again, these are common symbols related to autism. So if you see it on a shirt or on a car or a backpack, the movement is away from the puzzle piece and to this rainbow infinity piece, because like we've talked about, autism is a spectrum and should be considered as much. So next up, this is the only police interaction video we're going to watch in this training, because I don't ever want to be a police officer, to be honest, and I don't ever want to backseat quarterback somebody doing a really hard job and who may or may not have ever been trained to work with people with autism. We're not going to watch the entirety of this video. Again, it is on YouTube. You can find it in the references. But that being said, this call started, and it's hard to hear, but this call started because a neighbor called the cops on this young man for throwing rocks at his house. And so what we're watching is body cam footage with terrible audio, of course, but I just want you to truly pay attention, not to what the officer does, but to the young man's behaviors, his language, and think about everything we've talked about.
Once you gotta be out with him. What you doing?
Saying I said quit.
Huh?
Saying I said quit.
You said quit?
Yeah.
What do you mean?
Chase Hartfield.
That's your name?
No.
What's going on?
Nothing.
Are you throwing rocks at people's houses?
No.
No?
No.
I got a description of someone kind of matching me back here in the alley throwing rocks at people's houses. You got your ID on you?
No. I'm sorry.
What's going on? You alright?
I'm alright.
You don't have any weapons or anything on you, do you?
No.
Do you care if I search you?
No. I'm good.
What's wrong, man? What's going on?
I'm okay.
Are you under the influence of anything?
No. I'm just a normal kid.
You're just a normal kid? How old are you?
19.
18, 19, which is it?
19.
What's your name?
Michael Moore.
Michael Moore?
Yeah.
What's your date of birth?
What?
What's your date of birth?
January the 20th. This is not a big deal.
What's your birthday? Or what's your birth year?
2000.
2000?
Yeah. This ain't a big deal.
So what's going on?
I'm saying I said quit.
You said quit on what?
I'm saying give me your eyes.
Give you your eyes?
Yeah.
Where do you live at, Mr. Moore?
Right here.
Right there?
Yeah. This ain't a big deal, is it?
Check one. Name, date of birth.
This ain't a big deal. I promise.
You gotta stay right here. Last name Moore, first name Michael, 120.
I'm sorry.
2000.
This ain't a big deal.
Well, are you throwing rocks at people's houses?
No.
Because I saw you standing back here in the alley, and then you took off running.
Oh.
Okay.
Okay.
And then you took off running, and then you come back.
Come back.
You come back over here. Let me see your hat real quick.
So hopefully you notice some of the behaviors and language differences that we've been talking about in stimming behaviors. So stimming, this is where if we were live, we would go back and forth about it. But some of the stimming behaviors this young man was using were he was rocking, he was playing with his nipples, he was, doing different gestures, but he was definitely stimming. His language was very different and I think quite literally freaked the officer out. Things like "give me your eyes" are things that he's likely been told over and over again regarding eye contact. And, it's not a big deal, this isn't a big deal, and he's just a normal kid. So all those are definitely not typical language you would expect from an 18-year-old man. But he was definitely escalating in his level of irritation and getting upset and not being understood. So like I said, the whole video is online. Feel free to go watch it. I don't want to ever backseat quarterback. I just wanted y'all to have the experience of seeing how those interactions that go bad can start so easily. So some quick stats that for individuals that are autistic, having lower parent education and lower family SES are also predictors of increased interaction with law enforcement. Having more severe comorbid psychological conditions increases interactions with police. Individuals on the spectrum that have behavioral symptoms and aggression obviously makes sense they would have more police contact. And then increased caregiver strain relates to increased parent-police contact. And a lot of those intersect, obviously. Typically, caregiver strain is greater when an individual has, behavioral symptoms and aggression. Their caregiver or family member is more stressed by this. There is a study that shows mothers of children with severe autism have greater rates of PTSD than returning Iraq war veterans, which is something just to keep in mind for your level of empathy and working with caregivers and parents. However, inversely, being engaged in the community and community services is correlated with less contact with law enforcement. So when we talk about sensory issues, in your job, you have quite a bit of things that can be very overwhelming for an individual on the spectrum. Excuse me. So for example, individuals may be super sensitive to sound. So if you're a canine officer and your dog is in the back just going to town and barking, you may need to move pretty far away from your truck. Absolutely with the siren, I obviously would not have that on if you're trying to talk to somebody on the spectrum. And you'll notice that they may not be able to verbalize what is bothering them, but you may just have to notice, it's covering ears, it's moving away from the sound that's bothering them. The same with your light bar, that's very light and bright and moving. And so it may be just impossible for somebody to interact with you with the light bar on. The same thing with shiny objects, individuals having little impulse control and liking shiny things may grab for your badge. That's, that's the perfect storm of bad situations for everybody involved, but it can and does happen. And then also sensitivity to touch. Typically individuals on the spectrum do not like to be touched, especially not unexpectedly and especially not by strangers. So when you watch police contacts that go really bad with people on the spectrum, it's typically because the officer honestly didn't understand what autism was, but also touched the person. So if the person, is moving away from them and they reach to grab them, and then, it starts a physical altercation. So just be super aware that touch is a very sensitive concept. So something to be aware of is individuals on the spectrum can be very easily victimized. Typically in their life, they haven't had a lot of experience in decision making. In school, they may have been in special ed and all the decisions day to day were made for them. They are often very undereducated or uneducated about any part of sexuality. And that is imperative and important for us to know, because that means they may not understand who can touch them, what can be touched, what body parts are named, etc. So it increases their ability to be victimized. Also, as a society, we have lowered expectations for people with disabilities, period, but more so for intellectual disabilities like autism. They have typically been rewarded for following the rules, and they typically are very good rule followers. They may have had limited socialization, which can play into things like depression and suicidality, but it's also something that can contribute to somebody being victimized, because all of a sudden, the cool kids are going to invite them to the party if they steal a candy bar or if they blah, blah, blah. So it can lead to some situations where they can be easily brought into concepts they weren't aware of. They may have reduced privacy. So maybe they don't understand, again, who can see them and see all their body parts and who can't, and what parts are private and what aren't. Individuals on the spectrum can have difficulty understanding relationships and boundaries. And I have worked with many young men on the spectrum that have had police interactions due to stalking calls. And they weren't in their own mind stalking, of course, but they don't necessarily always get the unspoken rules of relationships. So an individual may have a great conversation with a young woman or young man, doesn't matter, and they think the conversation went so well that they're now boyfriend and girlfriend, and they start doing some stalking behaviors and going by the house and texting and calling, and they may not understand what typical boundaries are for those behaviors. You know, what is the rule to follow? How many times can you go to this person's house and knock on the door? How many times can you call or text? So those things aren't defined societally, and that gets these young, I say young, it doesn't have to be young, these individuals in trouble with the law because they don't understand what we call is the hidden curriculum. So the hidden curriculum is all the things in our life and in society that nobody's ever explained to you, but that you understand. Often individuals on the spectrum just don't get it. So that can be things like, an example I like to give is urinals. So obviously I identify as female and don't use urinals, but I have been told that in the men's room, you don't speak to each other, and you most certainly don't make eye contact with each other. Where in the women's room, you can make eye contact and you can talk even in the stalls, like, you know, people do, people don't, but it's not a hard and fast no as it appears to be in the men's room. And there's also, apparently, I've been told, if there's multiple urinals and there's one person using a urinal, you do not use the one directly near them if there's other options. So think about your own experiences and who's ever explained those things to you. You know, maybe your parents did, but most of the time we just notice things socially and then we do those behaviors. So individuals may do things like follow a young woman into the bathroom or something that gets you on the scene without them ever realizing there was a boundary there that they violated. So this goes back and, you know, you can get calls where somebody thinks somebody is their boyfriend or girlfriend and they're not, or they've, you know, only chatted online, et cetera, et cetera. So they don't necessarily understand the social norms that you might assume is common sense. So some very concrete things you can do in your interactions with individuals on the spectrum. One is be patient. The number one tool you have when working with individuals on the spectrum, when your life's not in danger and their life's not in danger, is time, is taking your time, being patient, leaving plenty of space between you and the individual. And you're going to give a lot of time for that person to process what you're asking, what you need, and respond to you. Going back to that slower verbal processing, you're talking at them is going to need 3 times what you think is the typical time to respond. In your interactions, watch the individual if they're getting increasingly frustrated or irritated. You know, for example, as we saw with that young man, Michael Moore, he was getting increasingly frustrated. In the beginning of the interaction, he wasn't stimming and, you know, tweaking his nipples, but by the end he was. His behavior was certainly escalating as he was getting probably likely scared. So notice those things and modify your behavior accordingly. So if that's, you know, covering their ears, maybe move away from the road or whatever it is, but being super aware to the number of factors that can go into your interaction being successful. Obviously, avoid quick movements and loud noises when possible. And like I said, do not touch the person unless it's absolutely necessary. Okay, it's not personal, it's not you, but this is where so many interactions go horribly wrong, is, you know, a quick reactive grab and then things have escalated. So unless it's necessary for your safety, for their safety, safety of others, it's better to just not touch them. And don't take any behavior personally. Like I said, I've gotten a number of rude comments. For example, one story I like to tell is that I worked with a man on the spectrum throughout my entire pregnancy with my son. And then several weeks after my son was born, this guy asked me, oh, you had your baby. And I said, like any new mom, yeah, he's this old and he's this many pounds and blah, blah, blah. And he just looked me dead in the face and said, then why are you still fat? And honestly, I laughed because I know who he is and what autism is about, but that kind of behavior would have made most women cry. And then not only that, escalated to where like now their friends all hate him and all these things. He wasn't meaning it personally. I mean, he was, because I was fat, but he wasn't meaning to make me upset. He was noting a fact about my physical appearance that he was not informed was socially unacceptable. And also use information from the caregiver or parent if they're available on how to best respond. Unfortunately, you're usually not going to get to a place in an interaction where a parent or a guardian has a tool that you can use that they haven't already used. So that contributes to this perfect storm of these negative interactions, because often whomever is near the person, if they have a support person with them, when something happens, they use all the tools they know how to use to get this person to de-escalate or whatever the situation is. And so by the time they've called you, they've used all the tools in their toolbox and they're coming to you to come with new tools. So it puts you in this honestly worst case scenario, because if this is a parent or caregiver who's worked with this individual, for 25 years and they can't control it, then what could you do differently? It puts you in a really hard spot. However, obviously, if you can get information from a caregiver, and de-escalate the stress and pressure of communication, then that's obviously a great go-to. So some concrete interaction recommendations are that you use simple and concrete sentences. Oftentimes we over-explain and say things like, I'm going to ask you to do this because I need to know blah, blah, blah. Cut it all out. Say, what is your name? Where do you live? Very small, short sentences. Another thing to be aware of is that literal thinking. So use direct versus abstract commands. An example of that might be if you say, listen up, the individual might go like this, and you think they're being, funny or they're being disrespectful, but you said to listen up. So instead, listen to what I am saying. We use this with kids a lot, cut that out. That's vague and abstract. So instead, you would say, stop hitting my car. People use this term spread eagle. Well, what does that even mean? So you need to say explicitly, spread your legs apart, and make sure you are doing this slowly and understanding that their processing is going to take longer. So it may not be immediate like you would expect. So very recently, this study came out that was showing the best case scenario for law enforcement. And I'm not going to go through all of what this would take because it's obviously a model, but these are some ways some things you can think about and try. So obviously approaching the individual slowly and standing at least your arm's distance away. Obviously, introducing yourself and why you're there. So something that I've heard a lot from officers is, how do I know if somebody is verbal or not? So the best case scenario is just to test it out and say, what are you doing here today? Or, what is your name? And then wait 30 seconds. And then if you don't get an answer, ask a safety question like their name or like their address. And again, if you're not getting any verbal answer, you might try and rephrase it instead of what is your address? Where do you live? And then if they have any answer, that's that reward system that they're used to dealing with. So you might need to say nice job or great work. And then again, if you get no verbal answer to any of those and you've waited and everything seems like you've tried everything you can do, then you can try to see where their cognitive functioning is with movement-based instruction, like sit down. So then if they sit down, you understand that they're, hearing you and understanding, they're just not able to verbally respond. And you may even have to give a model or a gesture, like, sit down like I'm doing, or come sit next to me. And then again, worst case scenario, physical guidance may be necessary, but you do not want to touch somebody unless it's the absolute, necessary option. So I want y'all to think of behavior a little differently. And behavior is communication. So when you're watching a behavior or looking at a behavior, you need to think of it as, what is this person doing this behavior for? Why are they doing it? So behavior either gets us something, gets us out of something, or because just in and of itself, behavior is reinforcing and feels good. So if you have an individual, who's throwing a chair out of the school window twice a week, maybe do some thinking about it and be like, this is happening twice a week and on Mondays and Wednesdays. And it's, there's some kind of pattern. Oh, that's because he's in math class. And when he throws this chair out the window, he gets to go home, but he's getting out of math or whatever the class is. So often it's thinking about the behavior more broadly than just, this person's having, a meltdown or a tantrum. So some ways that you can de-escalate situations with individuals on the autism spectrum are things like backing away physically, giving physical space, turning off your lights. Time is the biggest difference you have, as I continue to say. So if somebody is exhibiting, a problematic behavior, so if they're stimming, if they're laying on the ground or doing, something that shows you they're really not in the place to converse with you, wait a minute without that behavior to try discussion again. The more you push, the more you escalate them. So space and time are vital. It needs to be said that you should reinforce that you're not there to hurt them. The way society is currently, you don't know how this individual has been taught about police, and you don't know if they've been taught like, don't interact with the cops, they're going to kill you, and then they see you, that is exactly what they're going to think, that their life is in danger and they're going to react accordingly. So you need to be very explicit that you're there to help, that you won't hurt them, and be calm and gentle as you say those things, as much as you can. To control the situation, it's much easier to geographically contain somebody than to physically restrain somebody. So maybe that's getting somebody to go in a backyard with a fence so that they're geographically contained, but they're not physically restrained. If that is the safest option, obviously your safety and their safety are primary, but this is just tools that you could use, or even having them sit in your car may be better because then they're geographically contained. But again, time is your biggest tool you have, is just to give time between questions, give time between behaviors, give time before you have expectations of what they're going to do. It's important to know that anxiety is incredibly common in people with autism, and it can look like a complete shutdown. It can look like somebody is just not functioning, and that's because of their anxiety. It can also be that somebody is so rigid in their thought processes and insistence on routine. So that's kind of like that young man in the video who kept saying, it's going to be okay, it's going to be okay. I'm, a normal kid. And he was just like trying to figure it all out in that moment, which he was obviously very anxious. It can also cause somebody to be oppositional or controlling, no, I'm not coming with you, I have something to do, or, just, I don't want to deal with you because I'm so stressed and anxious about this encounter. It can also lead to anger, aggression, and self-injury. And then finally, like all humans, it can be fight, flight, or freeze. Something important to know is that because of the sensory differences experienced by autistic people, they may not react to pain in the same way you would expect, and therefore they may not understand like a pain rating measurement of something like you're at a car accident and this individual is not telling you they're hurting, but it's clear they are. That may be very accurate. They may not be experiencing pain the same way you would expect. And that's the same with cold, heat, and it can be very confusing to show up on scene and have an individual, you know, who's basically in early stages hypothermia, but they're not even telling you, you know, they're uncomfortable. They're telling you they're fine. They may fail to acknowledge the pain despite pathology being present. So again, like the car wreck, you show up and there's clearly something the matter with this individual, but they aren't complaining or even aware of it. And then finally, they may show an unusual pain response, something like laughing or humming or singing or taking off their clothes, which is unexpected, you know, unexpected to the typical response to pain. So going through one more time, speak slowly, give plenty of time for the individual to respond, allow a caretaker to ride with the individual if you're, let's do. So finally, as we're talking about individuals who are nonverbal, it's important that you speak respectfully about the individual regardless of their ability to verbalize anything back to you. Don't presume incompetence, always assume competence, just like you would want done for yourself or anybody in your family if you were unable to speak. So don't assume that somebody who isn't verbal doesn't understand what you're saying on the radio or what you're saying to your peers that show up on scene. However, it's important to think about alternative responses, ways that somebody could respond who is not verbal. So that could be their cell phone. You might notice they have a cell phone and you might, you know, see if you could write a text and have them respond or ask them a question and have them respond on text. Verbal engagement is not the best mode of communication for people on the spectrum. And I do understand your job. So I know that most of it is that verbal piece, but thinking of other tools to use, it could be, you know, your little pen and paper out of your pocket. It could be a laptop, but you may have to try alternative types of communication to get the information you need. So to sum it all up, I thought this was a great model that somebody had already made, not my creation, it's cited below. But what your best mode of action is approaching the person in a quiet, non-threatening manner, understanding that touching is going to have a bad reaction, talking in the calmest voice you can, using simple and direct instructions, and evaluate the situation and adjust yourself. So if you're getting too close and that's escalating the situation, if your lights are escalating the situation, evaluate what is escalating and de-escalating the situation for this individual. And then again, maintain a safe behavior, maintain a safe distance until any inappropriate behaviors lessen. So again, it's not trying to get somebody's name as they're, you know, laying and hitting the ground. It's not trying to understand where they live while they're literally, you know, having a full meltdown. It's taking that minute between behaviors to try anything new. So here are some specific resources for Utah parents and caregivers. I know officers I have trained have said that's their number one complaint, is that when they go out and on calls and interact with caregivers, they don't have any resources to give them. So these two are both great ones that give information about Utah resources for parents. So I just recommend that officers know these to at least have a resource to provide the parents to look into. And finally, it is my email address. I'm always happy to kind of think about problem solving or updating, you know, policy or thinking about ways we can improve officer training around autism specifically. And I have also provided the references utilized in this training. So that being said, I am done with this part, and next you will take the quiz.